Kia ora koutou, everybody. My name is Marcelo, as Craig has just informed you. This is You Are Your DNA, ? High-speed pictures in a hot debate in association with Craig's work, actually. It's a beautiful work out there in the atrium. And his work is the analysis of Billy Apple's genome, a collaborative project between him and Billy Apple. And it's part of the New Zealand International Science Festival, a wonderful festival, and organised in association with both him, Unitec, the Science Communication Association of New Zealand, the Dunedin Public Art Gallery, the Centre for Science Communication, and the University of Otago. It's wonderful to see you here on a blustery, wintry Dunedin evening. We're going to have a wonderful time here, having two teams of the highest calibre debate: science, art, humanities, and whether or not you are your DNA. If I can just introduce the wonderful teams that we've got on the yes side, arguing that yes, you are your DNA. We have Lisa Matisoo-Smith from the University of Otago, who's a professor of biological anthropology, a molecular anthropologist, she says she likes to be called, potentially not, I don't know. John Pusateri from Unitec, apparently an artist, but having talked with him, more of a scientist, I think, a wonderful combination of them both. And Ihirangi Heke from the New Zealand Academy of Sport, who is a Maori health and physical activity consultant, and who's going to talk to us a great deal about whakapapa, apparently. On the no side, no, you are not your DNA. We have Peter Deardon, who is from the University of Otago and the director of genetics Otago in the biochemistry department, and leads the laboratory for evolution and development. We have Stelarc, who is based at Curtin University in Perth, who is a performance artist and who has visually probed and acoustically amplified his body. We'll let him fill you out on what that means. And finally, my friend and colleague, but I'm not biased in any way possible, from the University of Otago Faculty of Law, Colin Gavahan, who is a director of the New Zealand Law Foundation Centre for Law and Policy in Emerging Technologies, which he said, and I agree, is in need of a catchy acronym. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a wonderful debate here, but as Craig indicated, it's not a debate that you're used to. It's not a format that I'm used to, but it's one that's going to generate a lot of information, a lot of discussion, a lot of light, and a bit of heat as well. We're going to give each of our speakers, starting with the yes side, 3 minutes to make their pitch as to why, yes or no, you are your DNA. Once we've done that, we're going to ask them to provide a refutation or a counter to the other side's argument. They're going to get a couple of questions from me, because as a lawyer, I think I'm smarter than them all. And finally, we're going to hand it over to you. We'll get some question time going. It's a long time of questions. Sometimes we only have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. Not tonight. We're going to get some questions from you and really get some information going. They're going to have 3 minutes each. They're going to hear a horrible bell at the time of that 3 minutes. So as your convener, as your moderator, and as your ruthless timekeeper, I welcome you to this debate. And I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker for the yes team, Lisa. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. As you just heard, my name is Lisa Matisoo-Smith, and I am a biological anthropologist. And I use DNA to understand our species, to understand how we got here. And basically, DNA is our past, our present, and our future. So speaking for the affirmative, I use DNA basically to track human origins and migrations. It was, of course, a great New Zealand scientist, Alan Wilson, who identified the fact that we could all trace our common ancestry back to a common maternal ancestor who lived in Africa 160,000 years ago. We can trace our ancestry back to our shared ancestor with primates. We can go back and look at mammals. We can reconstruct the history of life through our DNA. So it tells us about our past and links, of course, to our present. The fact that I'm standing here and what you see in front of you, a female person of probably above average height, comes from the fact that I inherited my DNA from my parents. 50% from my mom, 50% from my dad. They're sitting there in row 3. Mom, you can stand up. And, no question where the curly hair came from, right? There's the direct inheritance, the family resemblance. The fact that I am, in fact, a female is encoded in my DNA. And what about my future? What diseases am I likely to potentially get macular degeneration in my genetic predisposition? Am I going to have early onset dementia? What's that word again? Dementia. Do I carry the mutations in the BRCA genes that might significantly impact the likelihood of my getting cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer? So it is indeed in our future. And what do we do with that DNA? How do we manage that DNA is also going to have a significant impact on our future. So affirmative, you are your DNA. Without it, you wouldn't be here. But thank you very much.
It all happened a little bit more rapidly than I thought. Apparently we actually got 4 minutes for each pitch. That's fantastic. That was clocked at 2.5. So either there's not much to say or there's just enough to say to make it clear. So
I get extra time.
Yeah, no. I'd like to hand it out to the no team. Peter, after you.
Hello. Hello. I'm Peter Deardon. I have notes. I'm a geneticist, and so you may find it rather odd that I'm sitting on this team here, because I study DNA. In fact, I was going to start with, I'm a geneticist, and it's been 2 hours since my last DNA extraction, which is absolutely true, which sounds a bit odd, but not from me. How long did I have? 5? 4. 5 minutes? Good. One of the things that really worries me about the way people think about DNA was displayed by our last speaker. We are our DNA. Our DNA will tell us what we're going to die of. It's going to tell us what colour my toenails are. It's going to tell us the structure of my eyeball and all these things. And the answer, that's true. DNA is going to set some of the parameters that produce those things. But even if you have some of the most, in fact, recent studies have shown that there are 13 individuals in the world who have particular mutations in their DNA which should cause serious genetic disorders who don't. Right? It's all probability. And part of it is probability because, can I change the slide? Because that's annoying me. Does anyone know what that is a picture of? Yes, what? You're nodding your head. It's a human egg, in fact. That's from an in vitro fertilization experiment. And I think as geneticists, we say, we get these things from our parents and it passed on. We forget that actually what is passed from our parents is that. An egg from our mother and a sperm from our father, and we build ourselves as organisms, right? It's one of the most remarkable processes, and that's the sort of genetics I do. I try and understand how embryos work, how we build the structures of where our arms and legs go, where our eyes go. And I know that it's not all in our DNA. For example, how many of you actually, what do you think the biggest decisions in your life are? You might think it's getting married. You might think that it's taking a particular job. It's not. Biggest decisions in your life, where to put your head, where to put your legs. Those are big decisions. The consequences of getting those wrong are serious. Everybody in this room is a survivor of gastrulation, right? That's the part of your life when you are most in danger of dying, is as an embryo. Those early decisions about where to put your head aren't determined by your DNA. They're determined by your mother's DNA, because your mother builds that egg. And that egg isn't just a ball, it's a structured thing. And those structures built by your mother's DNA determine where your head is going to be. So, because of the vagaries of inheritance, you may have an influence in the structure of your egg from DNA from your mother, which you never inherit. Your DNA does not determine those early structures, your mother's does. And so, actually, how can we say that our DNA determines us? It's the only thing when actually our mother's DNA built much of our structures, made those big early decisions. And when it comes down to it, I don't really believe that the history of evolution is the history of you or I. It's the history of those, right? There's a chicken and egg aspect to this whole thing, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? The answer to that question to an evolutionary biologist is, and you'll forgive me, theropod dinosaurs, right? Because everything is related. What came before birds? Theropod dinosaurs. What came before us? There is an unbroken chain of structured eggs going back into the depths of time to the earliest animals who started to reproduce in this way, all structuring their egg. And that history is imprinted on the structure of our egg and helps us determine where our heads are and our arms are and where our legs are. So it's not just our DNA, it's also the inheritance of egg-like structures. Alongside this, we're now discovering that the influences in your life cycle, in your life, see, I'm hoping, how we go? 30 seconds? 30 seconds. It can also be transmitted, right? There's this experiment where people took mice and they shouted at them for days on end till the mice were really frightened and showed that those mice pass on that fear to their offspring. We don't know how, but it's not DNA. It may be associated with DNA, it's not DNA. There is much to learn. We shouldn't stand around thinking that our DNA determines who and what we are. It is a collaboration between our DNA, between our environment, between our family history, our evolutionary history. And there's the bell.
Thanks very much, Peter. And now to our first artist of the evening. I hand you to John.
Is that what we're voting for?
Hello. So I'm going to probably not speak very clearly. I'll stumble a bit, but genetic mutations is something that I didn't think much about until I immigrated to New Zealand. And you have to go through routine medical screenings. And in that process, it was flagged that I might not be completely unmutated. And in that process, they said that you might not be allowed in New Zealand. And I was pretty upset at the time. I met the love of my life here, and I wanted to stay in New Zealand. I had been offered a job, and everything was lined up for it to be a good situation. And then a flag went up saying that I've got too much iron in my body. I've got what's called genetic hemochromatosis, which is very common, I found out since then. It's a recessive genetic disorder. I need both parents to have this. And I thought, well, this is my luck. I already have a genetic blood disease called thalassemia from my Irish ancestry. So I now find out I've got 2 hereditary blood diseases, and both of them are iron overloading. And basically, my ancestors survived because of this genetic mutation. When you have too much iron, you could survive on chips for a very long time without getting any issues. And that's my Celtic heritage. And then with the thalassemia, I'm also immune to getting, what's again?
Malaria.
Malaria, yeah. So immune from the plague, immune from malaria, and also I can last a long time on a ship. And so those were all beneficial things, and so I've survived because of these genetic mutations. But in modern society, where we've got iron supplemented pills, a lot of the pipes that I've drinking water out of have iron. A lot of the cereals are fortified, and then I basically was being poisoned from this. And so I now have severe liver fibrosis from this situation. Having a liver biopsy was not a welcome that I wanted when I came to New Zealand, but I had my liver biopsied, stage 4 liver fibrosis, and so my behavior has to change. You know, I never drank, but I shouldn't drink, and so that reaffirms my decision to no drinking, minimize the amount of meat in my diet, and a whole variety of other conditions. And so my thinking and my behavior changed since this awareness of my own genetic makeup, which was quite meta thinking and meta being. You know, this whole process of being aware of my code that is mutated. But in my art practice, I engage with museum specimens, and I'm interested in species and when species become extinct and the speciation or the creation of new specimens. And this is a modified owl that I've generated through photo manipulation, but blue is a color you can't camouflage in nature so easily, and owls, being a bird of, predator type bird, they need to stay stealthy and hide. And with our kind of lack of environment, the destruction of forests, the amount of places for them to become camouflage is reducing, and so when are they going to have to become neon or blue or a different coloration to blend into their changing environment? And so in some ways, a lot of them will die out. And by dying out, there's going to be a lack of diversity. So a loss of diversity now, blocks the future potential of new speciation. And so I'm quite interested in the past, how we've survived through mutations, current situations and the loss of genetics now, and how the loss of genetics now actually does, in real terms, mean the lack of genetic diversity in the future and the lack of potential mutations that can be beneficial. So what mutations are we losing now? What mutations are we not able to capitalize on for future survival? And so we are our DNA, and without our DNA, or the lack of the DNA, we're blocking our future mutation and our future survival. So that's my stance.
Thanks very much, John. And now we have Stelarc.
Thank you. I've always considered the body not as an object of desire, but rather an object to redesign. So my name is Stelarc, and I'm from the School of Design and Art, Curtin University in Perth. So I filmed 3 metres of internal body space. I've suspended my body with hooks into the skin, about 27 of them. I've performed with a third hand, an extended arm, a 6-legged walking robot, a prosthetic head, performed with my 4 avatar clones, and now I'm surgically constructing and stem cell growing an ear on my arm. I've also inserted a sculpture inside my stomach. So you have to imagine this object opening and closing, extending and retracting, has a flashing light and a beeping sound. So this sculpture is not a sculpture in a public space, but in a private physiological space of my stomach. It was part of the sculpture Triennale, whose theme was site-specific works. So for me, the biological body is profoundly obsolete and totally inadequate in itself to perform in a technological terrain of precise, powerful and speedy machines. So if you assert that you are your DNA, then you are not only asserting that you are determined in your life, but also that what happens to you is inevitable. So you have to make that sort of Daniel Dennett distinction between determinism and what's actually inevitable. We may contest definitions of intentionality and identity, but it's difficult to deny agency in our interactions with our social world. So in a human world, we function in realms not only of necessity, but also of contingency and choice. A merely DNA body is a zombie body. Yes, you would be able to respond and interact in the world, but you would lack the subtlety, sensibility and comprehension, as well as the appropriate behaviour that we consider part of being human. In other words, a person is a social, cultural, historical and technological construct that is constantly being reconfigured in a kind of Heideggerian throwness into the world, into a particular time in our history. So it's meaningless to keep resorting to DNA as a definition of a person. Perhaps as a definition of a body, but not of a person. You are not. So now you're not merely a zombie, but you've become a kind of cyborg body constructed by new kinds of materiality and virtuality. The mathematician and philosopher Alfred Whitehead said that our imaginations are only as good as our instruments. Technology is not an alien other, it's the trajectory of technology that largely determines our humanity. So our interactions with the world are increasingly screen-based. In fact, skins now collapse onto screens, creating new sensuous surfaces of phantom faces of virtuality and interaction. And that's what we do with our media all the time. Marshall McLuhan has a good definition of technology. Technology is the external organs of the body. We've evolved as biological bodies with soft internal organs. Now we need to engineer additional augmentations, external organs for the body. So you, we, I are not merely evolutionary architectures. There are a multiplicity of contestable constructs of what a person is and how a person operates in the world. You are not simplistically your DNA, you are a contemporary chimera of meat, metal and code.
Thank you, Stelarc. And rounding off the yes team, we have Ihi. Welcome.
Bonsoir, ça va? Je suis Justin Ihirangi Heke. Je ordinaire de Tahiti. I'm just pissing with you here. I'm actually Maori. But I might be Tahitian. If we think about the number of Maori that are all through Polynesia, through Easter Island, through Tahiti, through the Cook Islands, Easter Island, into Hawaii, the fact that Maori people have moved all through the Pacific. Now, the Pacific is seen as the most violent ocean on the planet, and yet we managed to exist there. Then, if I have come from Tahiti, because they're pretty good-looking people over there, if we have come from Tahiti and arrived here, we've managed to survive the most brutal ocean on the world. We've managed to survive tribal warfare once we arrived. We've managed to survive introduced disease. We've managed to survive, dare I say it, institutionalized racism. And yet we're still here. Māori have managed to survive all of those things. In fact, I think that, much like African American people that have survived slavery, survived the boat ride across and survived gang warfare, what we see in Māori today is the best of the best. We hear a number of stories about the increase in diabetes, the amount of CVD, cardiovascular disease. I prefer to look at the number of Māori that have made it, and that they're as good as we're going to get. And any chair that's empty to here today, the families that didn't pursue the right attributes, that didn't pursue the right things to make sure that their people survived, but mine did. Now, how am I going for time? Because I've got a quick story.
Yeah.
Awesome. This one kind of helps these chaps over here, maybe one of them anyway. If we look at Māori mythology, there's the idea of rangi, the sky father and the earth mother, Papatuanuku being separated. And when this happened, there was one of the brothers that was amongst them there that said, well, I don't think it should happen. And there were two other brothers that said, well, we think it should. And he said, if you oppose me, I'm going to scalp you and use your headpiece for an ornament for my belt. These two younger brothers said, well, you're old, you won't catch us. He did. He caught one of them and he scalped them. Now, in that process is the origin of all baldness in humankind. True story, true story. So what that meant to me was, actually, Stelarc and I are closer to gods than most others. And there's one or two of you others out here I noticed as well. But the interesting part is that that particular brother went on to become the Atua, or the god of all river rocks. Because we have the sand and we have the smooth surface that sticks through the sand. So he went on to other roles as well. But I'm not trying to help Stelarc out here, but merely to say that we do have a number of those stories that roll true. Now, this final picture behind me here, this is two of my three daughters. My beautiful wife's over here. She's the one with the green eyes. And you notice this one's got green eyes, the other one's got blue eyes. My little one that's not here, she's got brown eyes. So I've got a mixture of them. But what I like to say is that if anybody knows about Māori people, you know what a decent pukana looks like, you know, when they're doing this kind of thing. So that daughter on that side, she's definitely mine. I don't know what that is. I think that's an Irish-Scottish mixture of my wife for a pukana over here. Now, my final statement to wrap this up is, I've often wondered about the intent of knowledge. Why do we pursue knowledge? And I've come to the conclusion the reason we pursue it is to perpetuate genetic material, to make sure that our people survive. So I'm not interested in teaching them about health anymore. I think actually health should become an incidental outcome of the pursuit of knowledge. So when I work with my people, I teach them all the stories. I teach them all the things about our past and how come we still stand where we do. So I think I'm on the right side of the room here, although I agree with Stelarc's bald head. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. If there's ever a reason I had to be mortal, I now know that it's all my hair, but I'll stick with mortality for now. And rounding off this debate, for the no side, Colin Gavahan.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, and thank you very much for coming along this evening, folks. So I am indeed a mere lawyer. I don't do any of these exciting things that Peter was talking about, like intimidating mice for a living. Unlike the artists, probably the most exotic thing I've ever inserted into my body is an electric toothbrush. But I run a centre where we do a lot of talking and a lot of thinking about these kinds of issues. And as a lawyer, it's quite an unusual, probably, occurrence in my career to find myself. It happens maybe once or twice in a career to find yourself arguing for something that you actually believe. And I do believe tonight, more perhaps by chance than good judgment, I think I'm probably on the side of the angels here. I think I'm probably right. But before I tell you why I think I'm right, I'm going to do a very unlawyerly thing, and that's to make a concession to the other side. I think I am something to do with my DNA. I think my DNA is part of who I am. I think the fact that I couldn't really be a professional jockey or gymnast or, let's be honest, shampoo model probably has something to do with the limitations of my genes. And like John over here, I probably almost certainly do have a genetic propensity to survive for very long periods of time on a diet of chips, or as we call it back home, Glasgow muesli. But I'm going to suggest that I'm not just my DNA, and more than that, I'm going to suggest that there's a danger that arises when we start going down the road of thinking too much that we are simply our DNA and that our choices are defined by them. Now, in case you're wondering what that image is behind me, it caused so much perplexity among my fellow speakers earlier that I was starting to worry that I'd sent them the wrong thing altogether, but it is in fact the right one. You probably wouldn't guess this from my perfectly unaccented English, but I'm actually not from here. I'm from Scotland, and specifically from the lovely city of Glasgow. And this image here is actually a stretch of the Argyll line. It's a train line in Glasgow. It bisects the city, really, of Glasgow. And I've included that picture because it illustrates something quite serious about the place I come from. Every stop on that train line, from Jordan Hill on this side to Bridgeton on the other, every stop on that train line corresponds to a reduction in life expectancy of 1.7 years. From one side of Glasgow to the other, male life expectancy varies by 14 years. Now, these are not discrete tribes of people who've never bred with one another. They do not differ markedly in terms of their DNA. We're all the same mad fusion of Celtic and Icelandic and all the rest of it, and Norse and all the rest of it over there. So something else must account for that difference. Now, trying to explain the Glasgow effect, trying to explain why our life expectancy is quite so bad, is still an ongoing field of inquiry, but it clearly can't just be a matter of DNA. But not only would it be a mistake to think of it simply being explicable in terms of DNA, it could be a dangerous one, because it could lead to a kind of grim fatalism about challenging the factors that lie behind it. I'm not a geneticist, but Steve Jones is, and Steve Jones famously has said that a belief in heredity, I think he probably means an over-belief in heredity, rather like a belief in predestination, is a good excuse for doing nothing. And it would be that kind of genetic determinism and fatalism that would be potentially a recipe for political apathy and for not challenging the things that we can challenge. Life expectancy in New Zealand has increased by something like 10 years since 1960. I'm not a geneticist, but I'm pretty sure evolution doesn't work at that kind of speed. So something else has happened. Something else has happened at a political and economic, a social level that's made a difference here. And the final thing I'm going to mention is one of the things I do, as well as looking at robots and exciting technologies like that, is I teach criminal law. One of the things that concerns me is the introduction of genetic kind of thinking into our thinking about criminality. Now, none of that's to say that there cannot be any kind of connection at all between behavioural genetics and criminal conduct. But the danger again lies in a simplistic determinism that sees us fail to challenge other factors. You've probably heard in this room, everyone's probably heard of the controversy that arose a number of years ago around the so-called warrior gene thesis, the idea that the low variant allele for the MAOA gene could in some way be an explanatory factor for the higher rates of imprisonment among Maori population. Well known fact, 15% of the population, over 50% of the prison population. An idea that that is simply attributable to a gene for aggression is simplistic, is dangerous, and is a recipe for a failure to interrogate the kinds of factors that probably do underlie that problem. Apart from anything else, as a Scotsman of Irish ancestry, the very suggestion that there might be a group of people in the world more naturally aggressive than us is utterly offensive to me. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to suggest to you, I'm not denying that DNA plays a part in who we are. I'm not going to deny that it perhaps to some extent constrains our life choices and opportunities, but it's very far from the whole story, and more importantly, it's pretty dangerous if we start thinking that it is. So thank you very much.
And there we have it, folks. 6 pitches, 6 points of view, 3 for, 3 against. We now hand it back to the yes camp to provide a bit of a counter, some pretty strong points there. You can all speak from the table in front of you and see if you can respond to their arguments.
Just very quickly, the affirmative side is you are your DNA, not you are just your DNA.
Oh, that's a technicality.
So from a criminality perspective, you know, we can find somebody's DNA at the scene of the crime. They are there. That is them. We're not telling us necessarily anything about their behavior, but it is them. They were there. They were present at the site. So do we have any other comments on the affirmative?
Oh, we've got stacks. Let me at them. I was interested to hear your argument about the chicken and egg approach there. I had an interesting discussion with one of my elders from the far north, and he said to me, it's a bit like the argument around student A and student B sometimes get together and we get another organism that comes out of that when they come to Dunedin, which is a baby sometimes.
It's cool.
But actually, he said it wasn't student A or student B that caused it. It was actually alcohol in the middle part there. So I don't know that it's the chicken or the egg. It's actually what they do to each other that causes one of the others to come out. So I don't know where that argument's going, but we've got to come up with something to talk about. I'm a little bit concerned about Colin's idea that 50% of us in prison.
50% of the prison population.
Yeah. Well, what I've found is that my last name's Heke. Funnily enough, whenever I meet other people that are Hekes, well, people that know Hekes actually, because my English name is Justin. So when I lived in Dunedin, any of my mail that arrived in any new flat, they were keen to see who this J Heke was and whether it was actually Jake or whether it was another J for that. But anybody that I meet that's known a Heke said, yeah, I've known some Hekes in the past. I've just divorced the bastard. Or I knew a couple of them in jail. Or, we had a couple of them on our rugby team. They used to start a lot of fights with each other on the same side. So, I don't know where I'm going with that argument either.
I think you're arguing for us.
I think I might just cross the floor around about now and I'll leave it at that. But great to be here.
I guess my argument is that we can modify our bodies, but through technology, which I think is augmentation. But I'm not sure that augmenting, like these glasses, don't in some way change my personhood or my genetics, but they do help me see better because genetically my eyes have failed me. My dad wears glasses, I've worn glasses, his dad wears glasses, and unfortunately my future child will probably wear glasses. But the augmentation through technology helps to mitigate, and so I can technologically bridge, some deficits, but I don't think that is necessarily sidestepping the primary factor, which is our DNA expression. Yep.
Strong counters from Team Yes, although for my part I only wear glasses to look smarter. But on the no side, do we have a counter to these?
Yeah,
Counter.
I mean, I think there's some important points to be made here. I think, firstly, obviously the production of children in Dunedin is non-genetic, and without it's alcoholic. The great leveler. I don't see where the argument there. The argument about myopia too. Yeah, I am myopic. My parents are myopic in more ways than one. But rates of myopia in the world are increasing drastically, massively. The rate of myopia in China, for example, is going through the roof. Why is that? Is that because myopic people are being selected for in the Chinese population and therefore they're having more children? Or is it because of the way that we teach our children, that actually reading your iPad is more important than shooting an arrow? And that actually we are training ourselves to be myopic. It's an environmental effect. It has nothing to do with, well, there's probably genes in there, but it's the combination of the two that's important. I think the other point that's been made is that if your DNA is there, then you're there. Can I tell you about one of my favourite animals? We'll never have seen one, and I've never seen one of these either, but they're quite common. They're a tiny little wasp of the genus Muridae. Tiny things. They lay their eggs in, they're parasites, so they lay their eggs in caterpillars, and that's the only way you can catch them. You find these caterpillars and you hope that they'll hatch and these little wasps will come out. These little wasps are so small, they are smaller than some single-celled organisms, and yet they're multicellular, and they have behaviour, and they search for their hosts, and they lay eggs, they mate, they do all this kind of stuff. And sometime in their life, they're so small that when they build their brain cells throw their DNA out. It's pointless to them. It just takes up space. Still a wasp, still able to find its host, still able to mate, still able to contribute to the next generation of wasps, no DNA in its brain. I know it's similar to the alcohol story. But why do we not draw the lesson here that actually DNA is a part of us, but it's not everything, and we can live without it? As I've tried to do. Oh, somebody else take over, right? Can follow that piece.
Even though I quipped that Lisa's point was on a technicality, I'm going to resort to one as well. And if we are asserting that you are your DNA, then what's problematic is the word you, because the word you is referring to a person of a certain gender, of a certain social identity, cultural conditioning. And so although DNA is the substrate for our physiological development, for our muscular, for our 1,400 cubic centimetre brain and limbs and so on, what's meaningful now is what we do beyond the boundaries of our skin and beyond the local space that we inhabit. In other words, we all now function as extended operational systems and extended cognitive systems. If you're sitting at a computer or you're using a wireless bit of media, you're an extended cognitive system. And if you're remote controlling a robot from somewhere else, you're an extended operational system. And so when we say you are your DNA, is it meaningful to assert anything like that? Because you're not, you're asserting something that goes beyond the physiology of the body, and you're asserting something that certainly is the evolutionary development and the kind of physiological unfolding of what a body is, but a body in itself is not what it means to be human. And in fact, what it means to be human is perhaps not to remain human in the traditional kind of metaphysical sense. And is in fact the perpetuation of the human species important, or is the perpetuation of an intelligent species? And I would say as a functionalist that in the future an intelligent system might be something other than carbon chemistry, other than a soft and easily damaged and vulnerable body that lives to an average of 85 years in good health and then it quickly deteriorates and dies. And that's a problem if you're already 70. So for me, DNA is totally inadequate. It certainly produced the wonderfully complex body that can interact in the world, but now that body has made artefacts, instruments, computational systems, fast and powerful machinery, and it's in that technological terrain that we have to consider the total obsolescence of our initial substrate, which was DNA.
So do you think telepathy is the end point?
To me?
Yeah.
Well, telepathy again is
I think your answer back.
between you and me. Oh, well, firstly, I think telepathy is a word that really doesn't, it's not so meaningful to me because it doesn't really say anything. I mean, if we're talking about some kind of, I mean, in a way, if you punch a few numbers and you're in Dunedin and I'm in London, and that punching of numbers creates a ringing tone in my mobile phone, and I respond to it. In a sense, our remote bodies collapse into one sort of psychosocial space of interaction. So telepathy is the kind of outmoded word for some of the more effective technological interfaces that are now being developed.
How would you define consciousness?
Yo.
Before we define consciousness, well, we should probably realise we've only got one night to do this. And human history is
We
having
can talk
difficulty
later.
with
It's a
that.
good question. Good
That's
question.
our reputation, I think, from the no team. And I'm going to try and create a bit of a conclusion here by asking each team a question, I think, that summarises some of the interesting themes that we've heard so far. Hopefully I'm quoting you correctly, Lisa, but you said we can reconstruct the history of life with our DNA. But to what extent does our history construct us? I mean, he was talking about Pacific storms and institutional racism. These are the barriers that Māori have had to overcome through their entire history, and the same sort of cultural conditioning that we've all gone through is present throughout our community. Isn't our identity more about community and culture and history? And how can something like DNA, microscopic and seemingly intra-individual, how can that account for our identity? Team, yes.
Well, we can certainly from DNA reconstruct and identify species. We can identify what makes us human and identify our human DNA. And it is what's made us human, in a sense, that has allowed us to be in this situation where we're communicating, where we're developing art. These are all the kinds of verbal communication and the way that we are able to create these images, these wonderful artistic images, and create this technology and so forth is because we're human. That's what makes us unique. So unfortunately, part of that is also the environment that we create around us, and we learn this behavior of racism, and we've created the economic kind of inequities that are driving a lot of this stuff, and that is, in a sense, also something about being human. But being human is in our DNA, and the rest of that is stuff that is learned behavior that is not in our DNA.
I don't know much about this topic, but the environments that shape us can help to trigger genes. And so epigenetics is something that is still, we have the code for it, and it's whether or not that code is tapped into. So I think epigenetics is, I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by this. ongoing discussion. But anyways, yeah. Sorry. So I think, yep. It's hard as an artist. But yeah, so epigenetics I think is something that does influence us, and which is environmental factors, but it's still, we need those codes to be kind of enacted upon. And I think that spooky action at a distance is something that Einstein had talked to about how molecules can respond simultaneously at great distances. So I think your telepathy interest would be answered by looking at some Einstein readings. And I think that when we think about us totally, we are more bacteria than human.
Yeah.
So I think that this symbiotic relationship that humans have with bacteria is maybe even more important to look into.
That's a good point.
Well, we haven't finished. Don't clap yet. In effect, I think I'm quite crap at this debate idea because I keep agreeing with these other guys.
You want to sit over here?
I'm all alone.
I may have to cross the floor yet, but I do like a good story. Now, a little while ago, I met Minister Turia, Tariana Turia, a few years back there, and I work in Maori health and policy, and she said to me, I'm from Wanganui, as you know, and I said, oh, that's lovely. And she said, now I've met some Hekes before. I knew exactly where this was going. I've given you the previous idea of what Heke usually means. And as far as epigenetics and environmental effects and how those pieces of code can sometimes be triggered, she said, now, this Heke that we've got in Wanganui, are you related? And I said, well, of course I bloody am. And she said, and how long has he been the president of the Black Power gang in Wanganui? And I said, for quite a while. Now, one of the triggers for this was, my father's name was Buck, his brother's name was Rex, and the one that was living in Wanganui, his name was Elvis. So what did you think he was going to do when someone gave him a fair bit of stick about being called Elvis? Was to step into that environmentally created response that might be encoded in there if we were going to listen to the idea of aggression being one of those codes and knock his bloody head off. So incidentally, he became the president of the Black Power there. And I also find myself supporting Stelarc on the idea of the argument about whether it's I or us or we or that individual approach. Unfortunately, I have to agree with that. I think we're products of envirophysiology. That the way we're put together has been defined by the place we come from, whether we choose that or not, and that it's going to express itself through you. Now, I used this example today, and I don't know if it was politically correct, but so far I haven't stuck to that anyway. But I've said that in some areas throughout Aotearoa, there's some of our people that are a little bit darker than others, a little bit shorter, and sometimes have face moko. And I said, there's a good reason for that, because he's from Tuhoi, so that means he can hide in the trees and move really quickly, because he can duck underneath them really easily. So I think when it comes to envirophysiology, you're built to survive in the place you come from. And if you're from the sea or from the mountains, you tend to have those personality traits. So, like I said, I'm crap at debating, but I agree with Stelarc on that bit there.
You're a true gentleman.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much.
And that's the case really from the yes side. So my question to the no side, before everyone starts to defect to them, is that we've got Billy Apple's genome up there, and my understanding is, because I'm no geneticist and I'm no scientist, but I do see great art when I see it, and we see possibilities here. This isn't actually what's going to happen to Billy Apple, but it's what could happen at this point in time when his genome was recorded. And if community and whakapapa and history seem to fulfill those possibilities, those communities are made of individuals with their own genomes. And don't we just have a multiplicity of these genomes and multiplicity of people's DNA really creating that community, creating that whakapapa, creating that history, that in a global sense, in a community sense, We could be part of our DNA. We are everybody's DNA.
Good point. And I think one of the things that worries me, so this plot is beautiful, and it's one of those plots that as a geneticist you look at and go, oh, we're awesome. Great. Can you read some of these words? I can't actually. They're a thing, maybe I can read them here. No, I can't. But it says things like obesity or height, or that says leprosy.
Billy's in real trouble.
That says leprosy. So in the United States there are sporadic cases of leprosy. Does anyone in the room know what's causing that? Is it DNA? Do you know? Bacteria. No? Because there's another species on this planet that gets leprosy. It's an armadillo. People who eat armadillos get leprosy. It's not encoded in their DNA, unless it's encoded in their DNA to eat little crawly things with hands. It's rubbish. Right?
Yeah.
So these kind of plots are a fiction generated by scientists who want to tell you that they can look in your DNA and tell you what's going to happen to you. One of the biggest problems in the world is metabolic syndrome, obesity and diabetes, right? Massive problem. So, should be easy to study, right? It's got a genetic basis. We know it has a genetic basis. So what you do is you take 500,000 people with obesity and diabetes, and 500,000 people without obesity and diabetes, and you compare their DNA. And through a whole bunch of horribly complex statistical tests, you ask the question, what in the genome is related to high rates of obesity and diabetes? And the answer to that question is, we can find some stuff, but we can only explain 10% of the variation. So we call, as geneticists, we don't tell people this because it makes us look rather less miraculous than we normally do. Right? 10%, we can explain, we know that the hereditary of these things is higher than that. We know about 60% of obesity and diabetes is inherited, but we can, even when we look at populations of 500,000 people, we can only explain 10%. Because it's not just your DNA. It's the DNA, it's the environment, all of these working together, and that's what makes the multiplicity of human genomes, the community. It's not just the DNA, it's the DNA interacting with the environment, interacting with all the genomes we carry. I apparently, though it's recently been questioned, have more bacterial cells than human cells in my body. That's not because I'm really dirty. It's just that I may have more than most. But you all do too. There are more bacteria sitting in this room than humans. In fact, I'm willing to bet there are more mites sitting in this room than humans. All right? That we have mites that live in our eyebrows. They have evolved to slide themselves into little sockets in our eyebrows. 30%
their
of people
DNA.
here have those mites. Are they part of us?
But they're different. They're different than other mites.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're human mites.
Yeah, but all of these
We
things,
can tell that from their DNA.
all of these things make human society and make humans who they are. That guy over there, I saw him scratching his eyebrows previously. Is that in his DNA or has he got a mite? Right? Let's not prescribe everything to DNA. As Colin tells you, it's dangerous and it's silly. As a geneticist, this is a hard thing for me to say. I'd like to say I know what you're going to die of, but I don't, and I don't think I ever will. I can help. I can look at that and say there are some things which you might want to look out for, but we can't predict what you're going to die of. We can't predict what diseases you're going to get with any real accuracy because it's all about the environment.
And probably now we're not any longer going to die biological deaths. We're going to die when our life support systems are switched off. So, actually, I agree. I have to say, I agree how beautiful the image is, the diagram is, and it's a wonderful kind of artistic expression of. It's a kind of data visualization, and presented in a very beautiful way. But it also kind of reminds us and possibly alerts us to the fact that this might be a kind of, augmenting what you've just said, this might be kind of the contemporary version of, those phrenology sort of diagrams, models, where certain capabilities, certain things were ascribed to kind of protrusions in your skull or your brain. So, yeah, we do have to, I think, probably all admit that the outcome of a person is this complex interplay of the original genetic substrate, which contributes to our being in the world, and then all of the interactions with and symbiosis with other living things, and we're part of an ecosystem of interacting entities. So, you know, we probably all agree that it's not an either-or situation, but we're making a kind of a distinction to enable an interesting debate and discussion tonight.
I would. Oh, sorry.
How about we leave it at that point just for now? Because I think that ends on a terrific point that this is an either-or situation in theory, but in practice I think we understand that there's not going to be a winner on tonight, but DNA is the winner on the day, I think. And at this point we want to hand it over to you because there's more debate to be had. We've got lots of time for questions. We've got a roving mic, I believe. Who wants to lead us off? Mr. Man over who was debating consciousness earlier. Do we have a mic for him?
What would Mr. Spock say?
The question was, what would Mr. Spock
logically
say?
speaking, I suppose the Vulcan, well, he's half Vulcan, half human, that's the problem. And Kirk, well, nobody really liked Kirk, but he had fought monsters and had... But anyway, back to Mr. Spock, who's my hero. And I think, logically speaking, the whole idea of consciousness and how the hell do you go from a single-celled organism to a human being? It's just the experiment in the 1950s was the basic building blocks of life are carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, electricity, and you get a protein. But and the whole process, the thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics is things cannot be created or destroyed. How do you get complexity from simplicity, from a single-celled organism, or even from the Big Bang? Because generally things stuff up. I mean, my leg's stuffed, and I'm falling apart at 51, and I wished I could run because I'd be in the Olympics. But anyway, that's just being funny. But yeah, it's just it keeps me awake at night.
So where was the question?
What was
Sorry, I mean, so
complexity from simplicity.
Complexity from
I think so. I was
primeval soup to human beings.
I love primeval soup. Have you tried the primeval soup down at there is a famous experiment where they put some stuff in a jar and they zapped it with electricity and stuff happened. And it's a demonstration that stuff happens. It doesn't demonstrate how life evolved. Well, it's the question of where life first appeared and its origin is difficult.
Blue-green algae.
On my face?
Could have DNA.
But the process of going from simplicity to complexity from then on is really easy. It's about the challenge of life. I mean, I was thinking, I'm a geneticist, so I think about genes, right? So you're a geologist. Yeah, that explains a lot. Sorry, it wasn't. I'd love to be a geologist. It sounds like fun. But I always think about genes, right? So, a gene wants to respond to the environment. There's something happens in the environment, and the gene turns on or off. As organisms want that gene regulation to be more robust. They want to be able to ensure that it turns on properly at the right time, and they want to make sure that it doesn't turn on at this particular time, right? So we want, you want a gene which responds to the tide, but not on particular nights when the moon's out, because you might get eaten, right? So that you have organisms that rise up. These kinds of switches almost inevitably get more complicated as they become more precise.
But there's a lot of luck in evolution.
Yes.
Yeah, but not randomness. There's a huge confusion between saying that evolution is a random process. Evolution builds on a randomness in the production of mutation, but it is nowhere near a random process. And it's really offensive to me as a geneticist.
We'll leave a supplementary question for now.
Next.
Hang on.
And we will have time for sulfites very shortly. Do we have another question, Madam?
We have a question here
We have a question here? Right,
for Lisa.
fantastic. No, we've got a queue. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Actually, I don't need this. Yeah,
Okay. Yes, you do.
Okay, we do need this. I just noticed that in the middle of the illustration, the piece of art is an apple. I don't know if that is supposed to symbolize the apple of Adam and Eve, because that's about self-awareness. When you bite the apple, you become self-aware. And I think regardless of whether you go back to the Adam and Eve or to the cave, humanity has been on a journey of self-awareness, and we've done that in different ways: religion, the Enlightenment, literature, psychology, most recently through team building and things like that. So my question is in the context of all these attempts to be self-aware as humans and to articulate that in a way to understand ourselves, how significant is the fact that we can now see our entire human genome? Now we can understand how it goes back to mitochondrial Eve and so forth. So how significant is that compared to these other attempts to really understand ourselves?
Well, unfortunately, it's a trademark. It's Billy Apple's corporate identity, which I think sort of takes some beauty away, or maybe adds some beauty. But who has a particular response to this question?
Well, yeah, good.
You go first, sir.
Well, I think that it's endlessly fascinating way of starting to understand some of our human traits and our humanity. I think that some of our main struggles as humans is the ailments that we encounter and our struggles with survival and struggles with life, and with the ability to find out genetically that I'm saving myself from future strife by knowing that I should avoid high iron foods, and by bloodletting. So by knowing my genetics, I'm capable of living a longer and healthier lifestyle, which takes away some stress, and so my life is a bit easier. And I think that the more we know and the more we're able to mitigate, or like cystic fibrosis, we might be able to avoid in the future, and we might have healthier humanity, which might give us more energy to create art and write poetry and engage with the humanities. In essence, I think solving some of our bigger personal and social problems.
I talk a lot with no sense to it, really, but I'm going to have a shot at this one. Because I think in terms of, you're smiling already over there, you're going like, I don't know where this is going to go. As far as
you say is a bonus.
Yeah. Okay. I'm helping out. I'll cross over that side soon. But as far as genetic material is concerned, I'll sometimes wonder about what the two options are for perpetuating that material. One of them is live forever, or learn how to learn. To become self-aware requires you to do that, which is that process of metacognition, thinking about how we think, has led us to the things you're talking about there. So if those are the two options, and none of us are immortal, we're required to do that in order to perpetuate our material, to ensure we survive. So I'm firmly on this side this time.
Fantastic.
No, not really, I'm still over there.
Question.
I was curious as to how we define what our DNA is. Are we talking about DNA in the physical sense of the word, or are we talking about the kind of conscious or experiential effects of DNA? And then what we define as we, I suppose. Are we talking about the conscious experience of being a human, or a human in its physical form? Maybe I'd just like to hear what the panel would define as what we would say our individual DNA actually is, and what we mean when we say that.
I would say that it's very personal. I think that the future of medicine is individualized treatment, because every person responds to medications in a very individualized genetic way and very different. So people of certain ethnicities, for example, might have severe allergic reactions to certain medications at a higher rate. And when we can do the genetic testing, we can eliminate a generalization and become very specific. And so genetically, they may not give you, an assumption of your race or genetics or ethnicity, that you might not get a medication, but in fact, you might not have the gene that causes issues, so you might be able to get that medication. So I think that it is very individualized, and it's not about we, it is about the individual, because we all have a very unique pairing up of all those codes. So I think it is very much of a singularity issue.
I'm pretty sure I'm not eating armadillos anymore.
Nice.
I mean, I would say that the we is to a certain extent the learned components, that we have our individual DNA, the actual makeup, of A's, T's, C's, and G's that create who, in a sense, who we are physically. Obviously, there's an interaction with the environment. And as a biological anthropologist, I was telling my students today, we are the result of the integration of biology and culture and how those things actually work together. But if we want to get down to the specifics of the debate, you can live without culture. That's called Australia. You can't live without DNA. You cannot live without your DNA. So.
That's a debate-winning zinger right there.
I have a problem with the whole thing. So one of the things that I try and study as a geneticist is how you get the differences between species. So not in terms of what DNA sequence is different between humans and chimpanzees, but what actual changes in our DNA that make us human compared to a chimpanzee. And I think the revelation of the last years of looking at the human and the chimpanzee genome or the gorilla genome is that they are vanishingly small. There are vanishingly few of them. And in fact, we share most of our genes with every other animal on Earth.
Except they're more moral.
Questionable.
Well, I mean, it depends whether we're talking about George Bush or not. But
Curious, George.
I think that actually the idea, I find it difficult to talk about the sort of there's a human genome. There's a variety of human genomes, and they merge almost imperceptibly to a chimpanzee genome, and they merge imperceptibly to our ape relatives. And even so far back as sponges, we can still see the same sets of genes acting in the same way, being on the same places in the chromosome as in the human genome. I often think of the DNA of animals as actually, that's the construct. Now, we can clearly say the DNA of animals has some really significant differences between us and fungi, but there aren't. I find it hard to point to the difference between us and a chimpanzee, and yet I think most of us walking down the street can spot a chimpanzee. Right, so there's something very subtle, and I don't think it's not easy to define what it is to be human on the basis of your DNA. That didn't answer your question in any way at all, but I enjoyed saying it.
Such eloquent answers, though. Next question.
Why would we evolve, come down from the tree?
My question is directed at both sides. Over here we have seemingly a very, how would I put it, mechanistic view of us as the product of our genes, and over here we have us as a product of genes plus culture, to put it crudely. But you've just raised that important point that there's not really, genetically speaking, a lot different between us and other animals. So how come the concept of the soul, the immortal being, is so unpopular today, when it would explain very nicely the idea that humans have some hard to define component that other species don't seem to have in the same way? And to use just an example, I suppose, if we look at something like the supposed intelligence of dolphins or dogs that we get quite close to emotionally, really I don't see a huge commonality in terms of the degree to which we think about eternal things. If you look at the dark matter idea, no scientist seems to have much of an idea what dark matter is, except that it's very important. And maybe we're at the same stage tonight, not really thinking much about what our souls are, but knowing that they're fairly important.
I really do have to kind of jump in here. Firstly, the more and more performances I do, the less and less I think I have a mind of my own, nor any mind at all in the traditional metaphysical sense. So you're looking at an obsolete, empty, largely involuntary and habitually performing body.
I've always said that.
Yeah, I know, and I love you for it. And of course, words like soul and words like mind are perpetuating a history of ideas which begin with Platonic notions of an internal homunculus sort of moving the body.
Please connect and try again.
Don't worry. Then we've got the Cartesian split between mind and body, and then Freudian constructs of internal essences. I think these notions of internal essences, words like minds, souls, even words like intelligence and consciousness, are outmoded sort of categories and they're just words trying to describe interactive behaviour in the world. I don't think they have any intrinsic meaning in themselves. I think language, on the one hand, allows us to comprehend the world by categorising and naming things and objects. On the one hand, language totally confuses us philosophically in a Wittgensteinian sense. So the structure of our grammar, essentially determines the nature of our philosophies. So I think we really have to get rid of this sort of nostalgia for the human, for the special, for anything special about the human body, as was pointed out. In a sense, we're a part of a spectrum of living things, and we're very, very, I'm really seduced by this contemporary philosophy which is called object-oriented ontology. And this doesn't privilege the human. In other words, a body, a viral code, a microphone, these are all seen equally as interactive objects in a larger system of things, a larger ecosystem of things. I've always tended to sort of deny that there's anything special about the human body, and I've always been sceptical and suspicious about the naming of some of these subtle behaviours like thinking or certain emotions, and seeing them as something special. So
I think as a biologist, it's really interesting to hear what is an empty vessel
totally,
spout things I would have said. Because I think the same things. A lot of my work is studying fruit flies. Right? One would not argue, I'm not saying you're a fruit fly, but one would say, oh, well, we're more complex than a fruit fly, but I've spent my entire scientific life being surprised how actually I can't draw a line between the complexity of a fruit fly and the complexity of a human. Fruit flies sleep, they display salience, they display all of, though people say that that's an illusion, they display all the evidence of consciousness that we have. So
You
Peter
can create
Medawar,
art.
the famous immunologist, said that, demonstrated in a beautiful essay that E. coli, a fairly simple bacteria which comes from our gut, makes decisions, makes very clear decisions. If it makes decisions, how is that different from a High Court judge making decisions?
Well, a bad example, Peter, it's probably...
What do you say?
we're going to lose the argument now between ourselves.
And I think that actually it's the degree of scale. People talk, the intelligence of dolphins. Okay, I'm not convinced. Dolphins are evolved. They are evolved towards the niche in which they occupy. A niche we don't even comprehend to this degree. The songs of whales may be very complex communications, but they're talking about things beyond our understanding. How are we supposed to understand them in our language, in the way we think, when they are describing things which are indescribable in our language? I don't know if it's intelligent or not. I don't know by what ruler I would measure it by.
Next question, yeah.
The mice, the dolphins,
Sir.
I'd just like to know where you guys think identical twins come into the argument of you are your DNA.
I think study of twins has been a universal indicator that DNA is highly important.
I would say that the study of identical twins has been a clear indication that DNA isn't everything.
Not everything, but
Yeah, we have that.
Disagree.
Yeah, medical studies on identical twins have shown, I guess, the percentage of which diseases are hereditary, and so it's a standard candle, if you astrological terms, the standard candle at which we can study genetics and nature versus nurture. So I think it's the pinnacle sense of where we can judge whether or not environment has a factor. So yeah, I mean it's everything really with the study involving humans.
My wife is sitting in the crowd here. She's an identical twin, so whatever she tells me to think, I'll say. But I have noticed a number of differences in those two. I hate it when they wear the same clothes, especially from behind. I'm not sure whose bottom I'm patting when I come in. But I'd like to know more about that research. But I did want to come back to this other chap's question for a moment there, because we didn't get a chance to... is that okay for the first question?
Yep.
Bugger you, Stelarc. I think I should be using your microphone because I keep agreeing with most of the things you say. I agree with the idea that anthropocentrism, I think is the term, of thinking that we're the most important, doesn't align with Maori either. We, as a people, will often stand and talk about our mountain and our river first. Because to think that we're more important than a mountain that has 1 million years of information to pass on to us when we might be here for 80 years is kind of arrogant. To think that we can't learn from the environment and find out more things that they have to tell us is arrogant. Recently, I spoke with the Maori Language Commission because they've got concerns about the lack of uptake of the Maori language, and I said, well, maybe you need to question where language came from, and it's not humans. If we look at the sound that a wave makes, it tells us something about the swell for that day, and that maybe it's not a good idea to get in because you're going to die. If it's big swell, big sound, and there's your indicator of the first form of language that actually comes from the environment. And so then for us to think that language is the forming of your vocal cords into a certain set of movements to produce language as the essence of where all language comes from is arrogant. So I think this pretty much firmly says I'm on the wrong table.
Question over here.
So, I'm actually going to...
Oh, it's not arrogant.
There'll be time for discussion afterwards.
Yeah, well, it's funny timing because he's just given away the debate, but I was going to throw them a bone. So there's been a lot of talk about genes and environment and how the environment also influences how genes are expressed, but not so much the other way around, right? So like before Dawkins was winding people up on Twitter, he called this the extended phenotype, that like bacteria have quorum sensing, you know, fish have shells, there's no DNA in your shell, right? Like, so why not our community and our environment being influenced by our DNA? How we could evolve to influence that, or until the singularity kills us, we could also evolve to adapt to technology, right? So could we not argue that DNA is more than just us? It's influencing our environment as well.
Yes.
That's a yes from me as well.
I mean, I think Dawkins' argument of the extended phenotype is a very good one. I also think that the entire book is an apology for the selfish gene. I think it's, as a developmental biologist, I think of the extended phenotype as the DNA helping to form the structures of the body. But of course it could go beyond there. Are our cities not a reflection of our DNA in some respects?
Thank
But
you.
it's the DNA and environment, right? You know, and you look at ancient cities of the world in places where there was stone, they built in stone. Where there was mud, they built in mud. The environment is a key part of this too. It's a collaboration. Shut up.
My question's sort of directed at that table, I suppose also some of that table by the history there, but sort of pulling apart the technicalities again, if we think of we or you, instead of thinking as a complex human, because let's face it, humans are very complex, and if we take it back a step to like E. coli, or even to like a single cellular organism, and we look at that, and that has DNA in it, and if you think about the sole purpose of that organism is basically to replicate, to pass its DNA on. And as you get more complex, like the meaning of life gets more complex, and that could go on forever. But are we, I suppose the question to put up in the air is, are we just a big sack of DNA so that we can pass our own DNA on, just like a chicken may be an egg's way of making another egg, as it were?
Well, I'm not.
Big sack of DNA.
We're all automatons.
Do you want to go?
Well, I'm not necessarily qualified to speak about this, except to say that I don't think we can kind of conveniently segment, this whole process, and even segment a living organism into its, reductive parts, and then assign particular individuated, functions to each. I think that's intuitively, I can't agree with that approach. I mean, and the other thing to take into account is that at every level of complexity, seemingly new capabilities or functions sort of emerge. Emerge is not the right word, perhaps, so at each level of complexity, you're going to get unpredicted capabilities occurring that were not premised necessarily in those individual parts. So is that okay?
Yeah. I think it's very easy to think in that way, and I think it's quite an illuminating way to think, right? It's about DNA, and I quite like the idea because it really speaks to that idea that I don't have a genome, I borrowed it from my ancestors and all the way back to whenever DNA was invented. But there are all sorts of levels at which you could think that we are but motes of dust kind of thought. No, really we're just the froth on the massive amounts of energy surging through the solar system. It's just, it's great. And I'm not sure that that's the point, right? And now we're getting a bit more religious than I would like to.
Frothiness.
Surely, it's your choice, right?
Anyone can change.
Consciousness. Make the decision. Are you just passing on your DNA? I reckon there's other things to do as well.
But it's interesting what's happening, because one could sort of say that the evolutionary strategy of birth and death, on the one hand, is to generate diversity in the human phylum, and on the other hand, for population control. So birth and death, to generate diversity and also to guarantee population control. On the other hand, one can imagine that if we can increasingly replace malfunctioning components with stem cell grown organs or 3D printed body parts, then we will extend our lifespan considerably. And also we do increasingly and exponentially increase, especially if we're thinking it from a design point of view, about the development of the body. So evolution takes, millions of years to generate an organism that eventually becomes conscious and makes instruments and machines and so on. But once that happens, things accelerate. So one can imagine in the future that an individual existence might morph into various kinds of phenotypes with a multiplicity of different capabilities and so on. Whereas now we live an individual existence, you know, in only one way, as a single body with, you know, a single agency and so on. I was going to say with a single wife, but...
I think we've got one final question down over here. Or one here? Okay, two final questions? Yeah, no problem at all.
I actually have a couple questions if I can sneak them in.
Quickly.
Peter, just to wonder if you could talk at a general terms about genomes and how they express themselves, like the genes and how they express and how the probabilistic factor comes in there. And Stelarc, I was curious to ask you about, from your work as a futurist, what your current kind of envisioning of what you see as being likely in our future evolution to be.
So, the probabilistic nature of the relation. So we can talk about DNA and we talk about phenotype, the shape or the behavior or the structure of an organism. And the problem for geneticists is that there is no clear way by which we can determine how a piece of DNA determines phenotype. Richard Dawkins said, oh, it's, you know, selfish gene is one gene, one character, and that the extended phenotype was this book saying, actually, I got that one wrong, and that there's a huge complexity. And that complexity is deterministic because there's quantum fluctuations in the way a gene is turned on and turned off. There are multiple complex influences on the way a gene is turned on and turned off. The way genes turn on and turn off depend on what cell types they're in. The number and the quantity and the differentiated nature of the cell types in our bodies are different between individuals and are a reflection of all kinds of physical DNA environment interactions. And so all through the levels of going from this piece of DNA to this particular structure, there are multiple processes which make it hard for geneticists to understand. And that's the real challenge. You know, we're not one cell type and we're not one cell. And that, to tell the truth, most geneticists ignore that fact, right? And that actually all our cells are different and they all do different things. Some of them throw out their DNA, some of them modify their DNA. And that huge complexity is kind of ignored because it's difficult for geneticists. We'd like to say, yeah, you got your DNA from that gene from your mother, that gene from your father, you get these characteristics. It's just not, in the vast majority of cases, it's just not that way. It's more fun.
No, I think it's a problem for me to talk about you know, the future as such, because you're talking about time as if something hasn't happened yet but is going to, and somehow we can extrapolate to it, and we can, but we're functioning always in the present. William Gibson and the theme of the Sydney Biennale, actually, or the subtitle of the Sydney Biennale this year was, and I've quoted that before in previous lectures, partly because I know William, is that the future is already here, it's just not equally distributed yet. Look, as an artist, I don't see myself as a futurist. As an artist, I want to actualise my ideas and to try to authenticate these ideas through the actions. Otherwise, why speak about something that you don't experience yourself? So you want to engineer an interface, perform with it, and then thereby have something meaningful to say afterwards. So I think artists are in the business of generating contestable futures, possibilities that can be experienced, examined, interrogated, possibly appropriated, most likely discarded. So I would not say that I'm a future. And issues of, or categories of the post-human, or transhumanism. Again, these are sort of categories of thought which we can't easily slot people or, all ideas into. But they do prompt us to think about possibilities. But those possibilities aren't interesting unless you actualise them. I can have ideas are easy. I can have an idea of having an ear on my arm, but without going through the surgical processes and stem cell procedures and so on to construct that ear, then it's not a meaningful process.
And I think, one final question.
That's a good area.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank everyone for a really stimulating debate. And just to finish, I'm going to direct a question towards Stelarc primarily and that kind of group. And while I agree that there's certainly nothing more significant about the human body than any other body that's evolved in the world, what I would say is that it is special to us because it is our, as Maurice Merleau-Ponty told us, it is our general medium for having a world.
Yes.
And it is, so part of the issue with things like, or part of the issue I have with things like object-oriented ontology is not that it kind of, it dismantles the kind of Cartesian dualism of mind, body, and so on, is that it simply just, it kind of reverses the trend?
Well, I think it generates new kinds of sensibilities and meanings. It allows us to re-examine the notions of the human, the anthropocentric, and so on.
And I totally agree. I agree with that sense. But I also think, when you mentioned earlier about kind of extended cognition and things, and that's certainly true. I don't think anyone would argue that our thinking extends into the world somehow. But the thing is that it extends from something, and that something is our body. Yeah. And I certainly agree that we're not our DNA and anything, but I think it's also slightly problematic to say that our bodies aren't in somehow part of how we experience the world.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that at all. In fact, I think, having mentioned Merleau-Ponty, a distinction that we make in our Cartesian mode of thinking is that we're sort of individuated bodies that occupy a space, and we can objectively examine and do science and so on, kind of rationalist kind of approach to life. But I think what's interesting about Merleau-Ponty is this idea that the body isn't so much inhabiting the world, but rather is an expression of the world in which we inhabit. And another way to see that is if you look at how ants perform and they seemingly perform complex, individuated and collaborative actions. But what an ant is doing is it's doing something that's seemingly complex, but it doesn't do it with a big brain. It's a small creature with a very small brain. So why is it doing interesting behaviour? It's not agency driven. The interesting behaviour is really an expression of the complexity of the world that it interacts with. And I think that's the answer that I would like to leave, because I think that's what your question was kind of prompting.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah. It's a wonderful point on which to pause, but it's only a pause because you'll likely have one of these wonderful tickets, and that gets you a free drink. And that free drink can be used to imbibe and then talk with your peers, as well as these wonderful panelists. Moreover, we have wonderful events here at the Dunedin Public Art Gallery. Tomorrow, Stelarc himself, as well as Craig Hilton, the benefactor of this debate, will present talks called Body Omics. And we'll be speaking about, Stelarc will be speaking on the uncanny, the creepy, zombies, androids, and chimeras. And Craig will be speaking on what is possible is inevitable. So the discussion doesn't have to stop here. That's available to come to tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. here. But for now, I want to thank you, the audience, and I want to thank, in particular order, Lisa Matisoo-Smith, Oh, and John Pusateri, Ihirangi Heke, Peter Deardon, Stelarc, and Colin Gavahan. Have a wonderful night, safe travels home. Join us for some drinks. Thanks very much.